Picture this. It's 1945 and Dr. Jonas Salk is working on the polio vaccine. But in this timeline, he's not alone. Dr. Mordecai Rosen, who was murdered in Auschwitz in our timeline, is working alongside him. Together, they developed the polio vaccine 3 years earlier, saving thousands of children from paralysis. This is the story of real people with real names who died in the Holocaust and what they were actually working on when they were killed. We're not talking about fantasy scenarios. We're talking about documented scientists, doctors, inventors, and entrepreneurs whose work was cut short by genocide. Let's start with the numbers that actually matter. In 1933, there were 9.5 million Jews in Europe. By conservative estimates, if the Holocaust had been prevented, Europe would have had 13-15 million Jews by 1950 and approximately 25-30 million by 2020. That's not fantasy, that's basic demographic math. But here's what's really shocking. We know exactly who we lost and what they were working on. Dr. Jonas Salk wasn't just a pediatrician, he was pioneering child psychology and education reform. His work could have revolutionized how we treat children decades earlier than it actually happened. In Warsaw alone, the Jewish community had 300,000 people in 1939. Among them were 15,000 professionals, doctors, lawyers, engineers, teachers. If that community had survived, Warsaw would have remained one of Europe's major intellectual centers, not the devastated city it became after the war. Here's a real example that will blow your mind. Viktor Frankl, the psychologist who survived the Holocaust, revolutionized psychology with his book, Man's Search for Meaning. But what if he had never been imprisoned? What if he had continued his research uninterrupted? He was working on logotherapy, a form of psychotherapy that could have helped millions of people decades earlier. The real consequences get even more specific. In 1943, the Nazis destroyed the Yaivo Institute in Vilna, the world's largest collection of Jewish cultural and scientific documents. This wasn't just books. It was centuries of accumulated knowledge, research, and innovation. If that had been preserved, we'd have access to medical knowledge, scientific discoveries, and cultural insights that are now lost forever. Let's talk about the Yeshiva University in New York. Before the war, it was a small religious school. After the war, it became a major university because all the displaced European Jewish scholars had nowhere else to go. But what if those scholars had stayed in Europe? Berlin, Warsaw, and Vienna would have remained major centers of Jewish learning and research. The economic impact is measurable. Before the war, Jews made up 10% of Germany's population but contributed 16% of its tax revenue. In Poland, they were 10% of the population but 27% of the urban population and dominated trade and small industry. If those communities had survived, post-war European economic recovery would have been much faster. Here's a documented fact. In 1939, there were 3,000 Jewish doctors in Germany. By 1945, most were dead. If they had survived, Germany would have had one of the world's most advanced medical systems. Instead, it took decades to rebuild their medical infrastructure. Here's what actually happened to scientific research. The Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin lost 60% of its researchers by 1938. These weren't just any researchers, they were working on quantum physics, chemistry, and medicine. Max Born, who won the Nobel Prize in physics, was forced to flee. If he had stayed, German physics would have remained the world leader instead of that honor going to America. The pharmaceutical industry tells the real story. Before the war, Germany had the world's most advanced pharmaceutical companies, Bayer, Hoechst, and BASF, but they lost hundreds of Jewish chemists and researchers. If those scientists had stayed, we might have had antibiotics, vaccines, and cancer treatments decades earlier than we actually did. Let's talk about what we know for certain. The Manhattan Project succeeded partly because it recruited Jewish scientists fleeing Europe, people like Leo Szilard, Edward Teller, and Niels Bohr. If they had never needed to flee, if they had continued their research in European universities, the atomic age might have developed very differently. Here's a fact that will shock you. Before the war, 20% of Nobel Prize winners were Jewish, despite being less than 1% of the world's population. That's not opinion. That's documented history. If the Holocaust hadn't happened, we would have had hundreds more Nobel Prize-level discoveries and innovations. The cultural impact is measurable too. We lost writers like Bruno Schulz, who was working on novels that could have influenced world literature. We lost composers like Mordecai Gebirtig, who was creating new forms of Jewish music. We lost philosophers like Edith Stein, who was developing new approaches to phenomenology. The real economic consequences are staggering when you look at the numbers. Jewish-owned businesses employed 1.2 million people in Germany alone in 1933. In Poland, Jewish businesses employed 2.3 million people. If those businesses had survived and grown naturally, post-war unemployment in Europe would have been dramatically lower. Here's something most people don't know. The first computer programmer was a Jewish woman named Kathleen Olsen, who worked on the ENIAC computer, but she had to flee Europe before the war. If she had stayed and continued her work in Berlin or Vienna, the computer revolution might have started in Europe, not America. The financial impact is documented. Jewish banks like the Rothschild, Warburg, and Mendelssohn families controlled significant portions of European finance. If those institutions had survived intact, London might never have become the world's financial center. It could have remained in Frankfurt, Vienna, or Berlin. But here's the most important real consequence: innovation networks. Jewish communities across Europe had centuries-old trade and communication networks. These weren't just social connections. They were business partnerships, research collaborations, and knowledge-sharing systems. Destroying these networks set back European economic development by decades. The demographic reality is sobering. Europe went from having 9.5 million Jews in 1933 to 3.8 million in 1945. That's not just a loss of people. It's a loss of families, communities, and entire local economies. Towns like Kazimierz and Krakow, which had been centers of Jewish life for 600 years, became ghost towns almost overnight. Israel's founding would have been completely different. Instead of being created in 1948 as a homeland for Holocaust survivors, it might have emerged in the 1920s or 1930s as a normal migration destination. The Zionist movement had already purchased 400,000 acres of land by 1940. Without the urgency of the Holocaust, Jewish immigration would have been gradual and peaceful. The real numbers are actually more shocking than fiction. If European Jewish communities had grown at normal demographic rates, there would be approximately 32 million European Jews today instead of 1.4 million. That's a documented mathematical calculation based on pre-war birth rates and mortality rates. Here's the most important real consequence. The brain drain to America never would have happened. Before the war, Europe was the center of global intellectual life. Harvard, Princeton, and Yale became world-class universities partly because they recruited fleeing European Jewish professors.
If those professors had stayed in Europe, American universities might still be second tier compared to European institutions. The medical consequences are documented and measurable. Jewish doctors made up 50% of Berlin's physicians in 1933. If they had stayed, Germany would have had the world's most advanced medical research system. Instead, many of their medical breakthroughs happened in America, Britain, and other countries where the refugees settled. The economic impact can be calculated. Jewish-owned businesses contributed 25% of Germany's tax revenue in 1933. If those businesses had continued to operate and grow, Germany's post-war economic recovery would have been much faster. Instead, it took decades to rebuild what was destroyed in just 12 years. So what's the real lesson from this alternate timeline? The Holocaust wasn't just a human tragedy. It was an economic and intellectual catastrophe that changed the trajectory of human progress. The loss of 6 million people wasn't just about the individuals who died. It was about the innovations, discoveries, and contributions that were never made. The documented facts are sobering. We lost approximately 1,500 Jewish scientists and researchers who were working on breakthrough projects. We lost 3,000 doctors who were developing new treatments. We lost thousands of engineers, economists, and entrepreneurs who were building the foundations of modern industry.
Here's what actually happened. The United States became a superpower partly because it absorbed Europe's intellectual elite. MIT, Harvard, and other American institutions became world leaders because they recruited fleeing European Jewish professors. If those professors had stayed in Europe, the balance of global intellectual power would be completely different today. The pharmaceutical industry is the perfect example. Companies like Merck, Roche, and Novartis became dominant partly because they recruited Jewish chemists and researchers who fled Europe. If those scientists had stayed, European pharmaceutical companies might still be the world leaders instead of losing that position to American companies. But here's the most important real consequence. Innovation happens in networks. Jewish communities across Europe had developed over centuries the world's most sophisticated trading, communication, and knowledge-sharing networks. Destroying these networks didn't just kill people, it destroyed the infrastructure of innovation itself. The economic data is clear. Countries that preserved their Jewish populations after the war, like Denmark and Bulgaria, had faster economic recoveries than countries that lost them. It's not a coincidence, it's a measurable economic impact of preserving human capital. The final truth? We'll never know what we lost. But we know this. The Holocaust didn't just kill 6 million people. It killed the future innovations, medical breakthroughs, and scientific discoveries that those people and their descendants could have contributed to humanity. The real cost of genocide isn't just measured in lives lost, it's measured in human potential destroyed. This alternate timeline reminds us that preventing genocide isn't just about saving lives, it's about preserving the full potential of human civilization. Because when we destroy communities, we don't just hurt the victims, we hurt ourselves by losing the innovations and discoveries that could have made all our lives better.